Okay, cool. So before we hop into our lesson, take a moment to kind of get some feedback about the tracker exercise, because it was the most different than anything we've done so far. So kind of what were general thoughts? You know, people who did do it, was it helpful? Were you able to put it in your flow of normal life? Feedback like that.
I think the time aspect of it really summed it all up together, like the worksheets that we all have, you know, tracker with finances, time, and then just even like the value sheet, you know, making it values according to time, or like prioritizing how we spend our money at the time that we have, you know. Really put a perspective on it, you know, for me, because it made me realize that, you know, time is a gift, just the same as finances, and that they go hand in hand oftentimes. I can do that more.
Thank you. Other comments? Okay, if you hated it, now's the time to do it, because otherwise we'll just keep doing stuff like this. Okay. So we're going to be talking about stewardship, like it says on the screen today. This might be exciting. Okay, cool. So we're going to go to 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 5. And that's where we're going to be in this week. And so kind of some framework for this lesson is when we talk about stewardship as defined as the job of supervising or taking care of something such as an organization or a property. So for Christians, we kind of take that a little bit differently, and we look at the whole of our resources as belonging to God, and we're just the ones kind of managing it right now, because in the end, really we want to be doing is like returning, you know, God gives us so much, and at the end, when we give account for how we use our time, our resources, our finances, all of that, we used it well in a way that glorifies God, because it's all His in the end. So stewardship as a concept, it's really broad, and it can apply to a lot of different areas of life, to be totally honest. But for us, we are going to be focusing more on what does it look like to have financial stewardship in our lives. So we're going to be in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 tonight. 2 Corinthians is a letter written by Paul to the Corinthian church. It's actually the third letter that scholarly people who are smart believe was written to them. The Corinthian church is super interesting because they have a really complicated relationship with Paul. So Paul founded them, and then they were going good, and so he's like, hey, I'm going to move on, God's calling me elsewhere. And then he got a report that they were kind of following after false teachings. And so Paul wrote them a letter, like explaining like, hey, this is the gospel, don't go for it. And then when he visited them, they were kind of just in open rebellion to him and not listening to what he had to say. And so Paul left, and then he wrote the lost letter, which was kind of, if you read 2 Corinthians, you can hear it was kind of just like an urge for them to repent and to really return to the true gospel. And so 2 Corinthians is born out of the fact that after that letter, there was a portion of the church that did repent, and they did come back, and they wanted to be reconciled with Paul and return to that harmonious relationship. But there's also this faction that was still openly rebellious and was not following the gospel. So we're coming out of the first parts, chapters 1 through 7. They kind of start with that reconciliation piece. Paul wants to first assure all the Corinthians, like, hey, we're still cool, I still love you guys, no matter what's happened. In the end, the gospel prevails. And then 7 and 8 is written to that same group that has repented. And so 8 and 9 is specifically addressing a situation, though, where there is a famine going on in Jerusalem, and so the Jerusalem church is severely lacking in resources. And so the churches Paul has planted are gathering a collection to go help them. And so one of the churches specifically mentioned doing this is Macedonia, and we're going to talk about Macedonia off first and the lessons we can learn from them. But 8 through 9 kind of address this whole topic of stewardship and address what does it mean to live generously in our lives. So can someone start off by reading 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 5 for us?
I'll read it.
Awesome, thank you.
Sorry, my voice here. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us.
Awesome. So thank you. The first thing I know we want to pull out of here is just the mindset that starts off this whole thing. The Macedonian church, they came with a mindset of just kind of thankfulness to God because they recognized that all that had been given to them was just a gift from God to start with. So they weren't being possessive of it. And it's interesting because, Paul points out like, hey guys, this was not like some really rich church community. This was a poor church community. But because they recognized the blessings that God had for them and were cultivating this mindset of thankfulness, it prompted them to be joyful. And out of that joy, they then contributed to the relief of the Jerusalem church. And so the first part of just cultivating kind of a mindset of stewardship, because stewardship is a mindset you kind of have to work for. It's not necessarily natural. But the first aspect is just remembering what God has done for us and instilling this practice of gratitude into our lives. When you're thankful for the things God has given you, and this doesn't need to just be material things, this could be seasons in life, this could be relationships, this could be anything that is in your life. You're more joyful than when you're focusing on the things you don't have. When you're focusing on what you have, you are more joyful, which leads to generosity. And that's how the Macedonian church, even though they were poor, they were focused on Christ, and that is what made them wanting to give out of a heart of joy to God. The second thing that we are going to look at, we're going to add on to this principle, and we're going to look at 2 Corinthians 8, 12 through 15, and then 9, 6 through 7. So we're going to break that off, and can someone read the first ones, 8, 12 through 15 for me?
Whatever you give is acceptable if you give it eagerly, and give according to what you have, not what you don't have. Of course, I don't mean your giving should make life easy for others and hard for yourselves. I only mean that there should be some equality. Right now, you have plenty and can help those who are in need. Later, they will have plenty and can share with you when you need it. In this way, things will be equal.
Awesome. And then can someone get 9, 6, and 7 for me?
Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. As it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor, the righteousness of yours spread.
Awesome, thank you. So we're kind of building on this first, we're cultivating this mindset of thankfulness and reminding ourselves of how God has been faithful in providing. So that's the mindset we're operating out of. It brings joy in our life. So when it comes down to actually giving, though, there are some principles we can pull out of these passages that help give us kind of guidelines. And the first guideline that we want to talk about is that when God calls us to give, the first passage that we read, 2 Corinthians 8, 12, it makes it clear that we're not necessarily called to give beyond our means. The caveat to this, though, is sometimes what we consider within our means and what God considers within our means is two different things. So I'm not talking about, like, if you had a child that's dependent on you, like, you don't want to give at the expense of the child. But an example could be like, say you're feeling called to donate to a cause, but to do so, to make it fit within the money that you have each month, you might need to give up like Starbucks or Chick-fil-A or whatever, And so that's something you're like, well, that's not within my means. Like, I'd have to give up something I want. But for God, if God's calling you to that, like that's a sacrifice God might be calling you to make also. So again, it's you have to walk that line of what is objectively outside of what I can do right now, and you don't want to feel shame. Sometimes we just can't give to all the things we want to give, but also reflect on your heart and see like, okay, are there areas where I could pull back and I could give to where I feel God is calling me to give. And so this concept of really it gets at just having this dialogue with God, to be talking to Him and talking to God about your giving. It not only affects how much you might want to be talking about how to give, but it also can apply to kind of where we're wanting to give. There have been situations in my life where I have felt drawn to a cause, but I have felt God say like, hey, that one's not for you. And so there's lots of really worthy causes in the world, but God might not be calling, He doesn't call you to give to each and every one of them. And so just like God, He's going to be directing you throughout this whole process of where He wants you to steward your specific resources. He'll direct you both how much to give and where to give those if you ask them and have that dialogue with Him. The second guideline that we can get from this passage, and Paul actually mentions this a lot during this section, but is just that giving should be voluntary. It shouldn't, 2 Corinthians 8:8 and then 9:7 again, they talk about whatever we decide to give, that's between us and God, and it shouldn't be because we feel guilty or because we're afraid of what people will think. In the Old Testament, there were all these rules and there were all these guidelines about like how much to give and at certain times and stuff like that. And if the idea of like generosity is new to you, that might be a good place to kind of start and like figure out some things. But under the new covenant, we don't have that anymore. We're not called to give certain amounts anymore to certain things at certain times of the year. We're called to give out of what God has called us to. And it's to be a genuine reflection of our hearts, a genuine reflection of that joy in the Lord that we have because we're so thankful for the things that He is doing for us. All right, the last principle we can draw out of this, and this is honestly, guys, a really rich section. So if we're going over it super fast, but if you want to kind of dive more into it, I'd really encourage you. Paul is pretty clear in these chapters, just ways that you can learn more about financial stewardship. So our last principle kind of brings all this full circle, and it's 2 Corinthians 9:8 through 15. Can someone grab that for me?
And God is able to bless you in abundance, so that in all things at all times, having all many things, you will abound in every good work. As it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor. Their righteousness endures forever. Now He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. The service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Because of the service by which you have proved yourselves, others will praise God for the obedience that accompanies your confession of the gospel of Christ. And for your generosity and sharing with them and with everyone else, and in their prayers for you, their hearts will go out to you. Because of the surpassing grace God has given you, thanks be to God for His indescribable gift.
Awesome. Thank you. So this last principle, I tried to boil it down to two things because there is a lot going on in these passages. But it's kind of twofold because it talks about the spiritual effects of our givings. And the first thing that we see super clearly in this passage is just kind of a brief assurance that, at the end of the day, God's got your back. He's going to provide for you because He Himself is a generous God. But also so we can continue to give as He directs. And I know, some people might have mixed experiences with a health and wealth gospel, and that's not what Paul's getting at. It's not conditional. It's not if you give this much, then this will happen, or God will only provide for you if you do this. It's totally non-conditional. God is a generous God because that's his character. And his character doesn't change based on us. And so Matthew 6 makes this super clear, and it's really beautiful, but it assures us that God will provide abundantly for us no matter what. So whether or not we're generous, it won't change the fact that God's going to provide for us. But really this is in here to remind us, like, hey, whatever you come to in life, you can be assured that at the end of the day, God has got you and he will provide. And that just leads us again to be remembering, like, hey, God has provided for me, and remembering that thankfulness, and it starts all over again. But 13 through 15 also gets at another really interesting aspect of the spiritual effects of when we are generous. And that is that Paul lets the Corinthians know, like, hey, your gift will not only have, it'll not only impact you, but it'll impact this Jerusalem church as well. It'll cause them to glorify God also. It'll cause them to praise God. He talks about how it'll kind of create unity between the two churches, and that they will then be praying for the Corinthian church. And also, like, it talks about this in 8 when it's talking about the fairness. Like, if the Corinthian church ever found themselves in this situation, this unity that they've created in this by being generous will also, the Jerusalem church will remember them. And so again, it's, God always provides for us, and sometimes he uses other people. And so this just reminds us that the generosity we have is not, it not only positively affects us, but it positively affects others as well. And so I know this is beautiful, and it's the best art you've ever seen, but kind of to illustrate this whole cycle, because I know I tend to talk very circular, and sometimes it's hard to follow. So here's a picture, and just to recap, the thankfulness we have when remembering God's faithfulness leads to joy in the Lord and remembering that he will provide for us, which leads to generosity, because we're not afraid. We know God has got us. And then for us, the cycle just goes up to remembering God will provide for us, and it starts all over. But when we include others in that journey as well, it causes others to glorify God. And then they get to, like, hey, God's faithful and he provides. And the cycle can start for them also. So I know at this point we've been pretty theoretical, and we've talked a lot about just like attitudes and heart postures and things like that. But practical tools are always nice too. There are ways that we can take these mindsets of stewardship and actually apply them to our life. And we're going to spend time really talking about 2 tools today before we hop into the activity for tonight. And the first tool we're going to talk about is going to start at the first part of the circle loop thing. And it has to do with the gratitude aspect of it and cultivating that mindset of gratitude. And when we take time to be grateful for what God has given us, it reminds us of God's faithfulness. And so the tricky thing is that's not always super natural for people. I'm one of those people that gratitude is actually not my default. One of my wonderful sisters says I'm the most pessimistic optimist she knows. And so I tend to fall more on the other end of the spectrum. And so something that has just been a game changer for those seasons when there's just no sunlight and I don't think there ever will be again is just reminding myself of practices of gratitude through daily meditation on it. So something I did this summer was the first half of the summer was just not very good. There's a lot going on. I do struggle a little bit with depression and was just really not doing well. And so I knew going into July, which is camp, which is wonderful and I love it, but it's a lot. I had to be proactive about my mindset or it just was not going to be good. And so I picked up on this practice of daily gratitude. And each day before I went to bed, I wrote something that caused me to wonder at how God had made his world, and the beauty that I could find in God's character or how he ordered it. And that practice of gratitude, it changed my mindset. And it made me focus more on Christ first and foremost and not all that was going on around me. And that, it didn't lead to financial generosity in that point, but it did lead to thankfulness for God, how God provides, His faithfulness in even the little things that I needed for the days. And that led to joy, and that led to generosity in how I used my time. And then ultimately, at the end of that month, I realized God is going to provide for me. He's going to answer my prayers no matter what happens. And so that is, if you look on your lovely stack of sheets, that's why you have a 14 days of gratitude handout. That's going to be your homework, and we'll talk more about it later. But I want you guys to take time for yourself to practice that. To each day before you go to bed or each morning when you wake up, to think of one thing that puts your mind on Christ and how He's been faithful and providing for you. Now, the second tool is, because we are talking about financial stewardship, is just sometimes a budget just helps us know a framework that we have to work in. And a budget, it's just a plan for how you want to spend your finances in a certain time frame. For me, a month works really well. You might find you need to do it more, you need to do it less, depending on pay schedules or whatever. But a budget just kind of lets you know how much is coming in and how much is going out within that time frame. And then really, what is that means that we mentioned earlier, what do we have to work with when it comes to generosity? And so you guys all have a blank sheet with a blank budget in front of you. And for some people, this might be way too simple. You might have more expenses, less expenses. For others, you might be pretty much on your parents' payroll still and don't have personal finances, so it might be like, hey, checking out right now. But I encourage you to stick around, because when you do manage your own finances, this will be helpful. But when you're budgeting, kind of want to explain how this one is broken out, just so that when we get to the activities and stuff like that, you have a framework. So when you're budgeting, you want to start with the proposed side, which is just your plan and the framework that you're working in. And the first part is your income. Your wages is what you can count on to be making each month. And then additional income is money that you're probably 95, 85, whatever, you're pretty sure is going to come in, but it's a little bit of a wild card if it does. And that, your income subtotal is just the sum of those two numbers. So that's what you have coming in, and that's kind of what we have to work with. And then the second half is your expenses. And so this is where the finance tracker that you guys did. If you are in a season of life where you are primarily responsible for your finances, and putting together a budget is a good next step for you, having that finance tracker is going to be really helpful, because it's going to give you kind of a baseline of what you're already spending. And so for a budget to work, you're going to have to be realistic, and the finance tracker is going to help you balance your ideas about how much you need to be spending and how much you actually are. And so the expense subtotal at the end, that's the sum of all of your expenses. And so the very last thing you're going to see is your net income. And your net income is what you actually make once you subtract your expenses from your income subtotal. And so if you do that and you end up with a negative amount, you're in a little bit of trouble, because that means you're running a deficit. And so you need to either figure out how to make more money or where you can cut back. If you get a positive amount, in my brain, I think there's a technical term, but I don't know it. I like to think of that as just kind of my margin. So it's not necessarily, like, your goal isn't necessarily to spend whatever margin you end up with, but it's more like a buffer room in case things happen. So, my car likes to break down and I should have to go to the doctor and all that. It all likes to happen at one time. And so having that margin helps make sure that you have money at the end of the day for that. So that's the whole proposed side of the sheet. And that's what you would do at the beginning of the time frame. So if you like to do the month, that's what you try to do either at the end of the previous month or the beginning of the month you're budgeting for. The actual side is taking what you actually spent and putting those numbers in its place. And you would do that at the end of whatever time frame you set for yourself. Now, for me, this helps me keep accountable, just for my personal self, but it also makes me aware of where my finances are actually going at the end of each month, and I'm not getting to this place of, well, I thought I was spending this much, but turns out I'm not. And so it can help you know where you need to make adjustments. It can keep you accountable. And so it's really probably one of the more helpful aspects of a budget for me. So for activities, I recognize that not everyone's in the same season of life where a budget is helpful. So I want you to first start by just reflecting on this stewardship mindset. You guys all have a sheet with reflection questions, and so go ahead and start with that. Now, if you have time afterwards and a financial budget is applicable to your current season, so you know whether you're paying for most of your finances, or you know you're going to be moving out soon, and you need to start thinking that way. I want you to put together a financial budget for December, and if needed, use your tracker. If you need to set a SMART goal to make sure that, like, say you need to adjust something here or there, the SMART framework is on the back of that budget sheet, and so you can use that to make your goals. But again, I recognize that a budget might not be super applicable for everybody. Your parents still might be covering most of your expenses, or you just might not make enough to really where a budget is helpful. So if a budget's not really super applicable or helpful for this current season in your life, I want you to still take time to reflect on your finance tracker. And I've listed the questions I want you to be thinking through. I want you to be thinking through, over these last 2 weeks, did you steward your resources well? Where did you struggle with being a good steward of your resources? And then look at areas. Are there areas where you want to pour in more? Areas where you want to pull back a little bit? And as always, the most helpful thing when you're answering questions and doing reflections is asking why. Why gets at motivations, and motivations will tell you a lot more about yourself than just doing reflections. So before we hop into your activity, any questions or anything like that? Okay, cool. As per usual, you have 20 minutes. Be back here at 8:20.